Hello, everyone, and welcome to an audio podcast under the Storm Robotics under Storm Robotics Productions. This is the Shientist, and I'm going to give an overview on the routine provision of red cell components or red blood cell components. And to start off, I'm going to highlight a little bit about blood component practices, at least from one main component, one main blood product, and that being the red blood cells. So red blood cell components are usually provided as the same group as the patients and issued after one of the following procedures, and dependent on the transfusion department practices. So, where transfusion laboratories would do a direct cross match if there's no history on a patient or an individual who needs blood transfusion. Electronic issue, again, if there's no clinical history or transfusion laboratory history on a patient. And electronic issuing of red blood cells is um, has taken over the fact that transfusion practitioners or scientists no longer really need to do as many cross matches using manual techniques because of how if there is history around a patient's blood group, anything and any clinical history relating to antibodies or antigens, etc. Transfusion specialists and scientists, etc., can generate electronic issue based on knowing and understanding whether there's red blood cells available according to the blood group of a patient or an individual, and ruling out, of course, any particular antibodies or antigens. Then there's indirect cross match, or what's known as an IAT method. And normally, what this is, it's a way to it's one way to rule out any particular antibodies by doing what's known as a small antibody screen. And after doing this, transfusion scientists, laboratory specialists can actually after doing an indirect cross match, can issue red blood cells according to the findings, doing an indirect cross match as well. And also an indirect cross match inside with what's known as an auto match. An auto match isn't actually sort of terminology that's used in transfusion laboratories as much now, but generally IAT or indirect IAT cross match along with auto match also allows laboratory specialists to issue to conduct particular investigations around and ruling out any particular antibodies. And therefore, when there is if for example an antibody or autoantibody has been identified, then what will happen is that transfusion specialists can request red blood cell components based on the findings, and any future or subsequent red blood cells that may be required for the same patient can be sort of stored in advance. So these are some of the sort of practices around components in transfusion laboratories. Another thing is one of the first first requirements for blood selection is understanding the ABO group of a patient or individual, and the requirement is this requirement is absolute. Is absolute in the case of those who are blood group O, patients who are blood group O, and also recipients who are blood group O, and any sort of derivatives, additional derivatives that are in line with blood group O. And as a general rule, in line with those who need red cell blood components, if volume replacement is required or needed, volume expanders can be or should be used instead of red blood cells. Volume expanders have sort of a pharmacological advantage in some aspects of practice that red blood cells units alone cannot fulfill. And mainly this is where, for example, certain solutes and certain electrolytes, for example, and also some particular component some particular aspects that relate to physiology, the physiological components, and that systemically need to be fulfilled, have to become more priority than red blood cell components and transfusion alone. So, for example, those patients who are hypovolemic, who have low volume in and around certain solutes and biochemistry parameters, then those need to be restored, because red blood cells alone will not help achieve a general hemostasis. Without that, hemostasis generally has to be hemostasis can only really be achieved in patients and individuals when there's red cells as well as a good volume of other solutes that may be lost in, for example, around patients who hemorrhage, for example. Volume expanders should be used in particular cases. There's also a little bit that I want to say about the subgroups of blood group A and B, which are actually unimportant unless there is a sort of antibody or a sort of autoantibody, and in particular when there is anti-A or anti-B present that reacts strictly at body temperature. It's important to know this because with certain blood groups or subgroups of particular blood groups, generally it can be something that becomes less priority owing to the need for patient's red cell stores to be replenished at sort of at and in around emergency related scenarios. So the subgroups of A and B become unimportant in particular in particular circumstances. A bit more about cross-matching. So when blood of the same ABO group is not available, the next choice is red cells of a blood group that is compatible by major cross-match. Now I mentioned a little bit about paneling or sort of manual techniques that are done to identify whether patients may have an antibody or autoantibody, etc. Now, when it comes to a major cross match, there are more serological components to a paneling investigation. So when blood so when blood of the same ABO group is not available, the next choice is red blood cells of a group that is compatible. And so, for example, in certain blood groups, so for generally blood group O can be given to anyone and everyone. Now, if there is for example, some incompatibility around around what would be the main choice for a blood group, for a patient who has a particular blood group, then generally speaking, on a major cross match, example would be that where there is no other choice, for example, then the red cells of a blood group that is compatible by a major cross match sort of paneling can be and would be appropriate. Now, another part of this is that the second requirement is that the patient should receive red cells or red blood cells of the same rhesus D group. So what this means is, for example, so let's say, for example, someone is group B, or B pos, then generally under B pos on blood component on red cell components that have been red cells that have been donated in blood donation sites, what would happen is that the red cells would be marked with the appropriate blood group, but will also be marked with potentially or what's more universally known now is a rhesus D as well. So or RHD pos. So for example, so the D group relates or is in regards to, so you have your blood group or blood group B, and then the D would be pos or neg. So it's rhesus D neg or rhesus D pos. So in a case of where a patient is B positive, then it will be a B that would be plain and obvious on a blood group on a whole blood pack, and then it would be underneath it'd be rhesus RH, which is abbreviation for rhesus, and then it would be pos in the case of someone who's donated, let's say, red cells that are B group pos or positive, RHD pos. So generally, anyone who requires a recipient who might require a particular blood group, then ideally the recipient should have the same blood group, same blood group of red cells that they have, ideally in a best case scenario. Now, I've talked a little bit about antibodies or autoantibodies. Now, I'm going to mention about a little bit about alloantibodies. Now, unless atypical RH alloantibodies are present in the recipient's plasma or serum, so unless there's atypical RH alloantibodies that are present in the recipient's plasma or serum, there is usually no need to match for other rhesus antigens. So what this means is that if there are sort of there are alloantibodies that are in the plasma or serum that that may not be the same, i.e. atypical, then this means there's usually no need to match, do cross match or additional investigations for blood grouping, etc., for other rhesus antigens, because what will become obvious is that the recipient's blood, recipient's plasma or serum would generally be the same as the donors. So generally speaking, the RH antigens, or the rhesus antigens, should only be investigated if a patient has known alloantibodies for any additional paneling investigations. A little bit about rhesus antigens, and all I'm going to do here in this particular slide set is just highlight the different rhesus antigens that are sort of known in and around transfusion laboratories, but also how these antigens are normally antigens that are listed as part of blood group, as part of blood blood donations, but also where blood is manufactured and processed, etc. And that is basically where, for example, you have where the rhesus antigens would read as follows. There's big K, there's small c, there's big E, there's small k, there's small e, there's Duffy A, which is abbreviated as FYA, there's big C, there's JKA, there's big S, and there's JKB, and there's small s. Now, as I said and highlighted, alluded to the fact that these are that these rhesus antigens are said in this way because in transfusion laboratories, that is how in laboratory practice, that is how the terminology is thrown about in and around areas of transfusion practices, according to whether a patient has particular antigens and etc. And again, certain investigations, additional investigations around cross-matching and identifying any particular antibodies, etc., autoantibodies or alloantibodies, can be determined, and when there are patients who may have had more than one red cell blood transfusion, they can pick up other antibodies, and if paneling is done after, let's say, several durations where an individual patient has had blood transfusion, then other antibodies can other antigens and antibodies can be identified, and there is an extensive extensive list where transfusion specialists can identify, and in specialist laboratories, what can happen is that, for example, if a patient has other has particular hematological diseases or a hematological condition, what can then happen is a larger more intricate investigations around paneling and serology and cross-matching can be done at specialist centers to actually then make sure that particular red cells for transfusion potentially can be available. Now, a typical, I'm going to talk a little bit about atypical antibody. Now, the third requirement is that antigen-negative blood is selected for those patients in whom a clinically significant atypical alloantibody has been detected at any time. I'll say that again. So one of the other requirements here is that antigen-negative blood is selected for patients whom a clinically significant atypical alloantibody has been detected. So what that means is that if a patient has a hematological condition, let's say, for example, is a known patient, for example, then one of the main requirements is that that transfusion laboratories can prepare negative antigen negative blood for particular patients, because they would be known to have a clinically significant atypical alloantibodies that could prompt the immune system to fight against itself, which is basically the very definition of alloantibody. Allo and auto, both in from an immunological perspective, more or less mean the same thing. Basically, to fight against oneself. So the immune system is either going, it would either tolerate is also terminology that is kind of thrown about quite a lot in relating to immunology, but autoantibody or alloantibody, if that's determined, then the immune system of an individual patient can either tolerate that antibody or antibody or alloantibody, or it can fight to cause more damage to its own to the immune system. Now, alloantibody and autoantibody in that regard also means that each time a blood transfusion, for example, is given or is required, basically the immune system of an individual has to be able to accept that the immune system should tolerate that autoantibody or alloantibody, and auto or alloantibodies, the sort of line of whether alloantibody or autoantibody causes damage through the immune system, etc., is determined not just by blood tests and investigations, but is determined through where transfusion specialists and scientists generally can determine the titer or the volume or the concentration. These are all important words because the concentration and the titer of an alloantibody or an antibody or autoantibody will help determine whether the concentration is detrimental enough to actually cause more harm than actually being sort of subsided, so that the treatment for again where blood transfusion is concerned or anything else, for example, can actually be effective or efficacious. Um, so on that note, a little bit about what about incompatible blood then. So if the situation is clinically urgent, antigen positive incompatible blood may be issued, but only on approval of a consultant hematologist. And take my word for this, consultant hematologists, they train train for a number of years to actually become competent in areas of practice, as do clinical scientists in known fields, in known areas of laboratory practices, and other scientists as well. But if the situation is clinically urgent and a patient is dying or bleeding out, hemorrhaging, etc., then antigen positive. So the antigen positive or incompatible blood, those two things, where those two aspects, if they are if in a clinically urgent situation, in a clinically urgent situation, and where antigen positive and incompatible blood is the only components, blood components available, even though, for example, the blood group might be okay, might be viable, but there's other aspects of the blood component, for example, that would be deemed as potentially harmful. In an emergency situation or a clinically urgent situation, then antigen positive and incompatible blood may be issued, but it is entirely upon a consultant hematologist, upon them, that actually make an overall decision, because hematology and transfusion is normally an area of practice that is overseen in some contexts by consultant hematologists, and then senior blood transfusion senior transfusion scientists and practitioners, alongside with hematologists, sort of make that decision, if required, and if needed. So in relation to this as well, in related to antigen positive red blood cell components, if the situation is clinically urgent, is clinically urgent, again emergency, then at the same time, it would mean that the clinician making the request for uncross-matched blood understands the serological risks, and also that non-medical staff, i.e., in laboratory in transfusion laboratories and in laboratory medicine, medical laboratory assistants, for example, and those who provide additional sort of hand in relating to, for example, where there may be a patient bleeding out or major hemorrhage that becomes aware of in a transfusion laboratory setting, that non-medical staff making the request on behalf of the clinician give the name of the requesting clinician, and also where I mentioned the medical laboratory assistants that who may be available in those situations as well within a laboratory practice. Also give the name or get the name of the requesting physician or clinician, so that basically when in an emergency situation, or where there's urgency around attaining blood components, that they have a named contact or frontline health professional who is accountable for that particular decision, generally, because it is important from general laboratory practices. And also on that there's also there's also an aspect around clinical need. Now I talked about where there's an emergency or urgent situations or scenarios. Then the clinical need is also important. The hazard of transfusing blood to a patient whose plasma or serum has not been screened for the presence of atypical alloantibodies must be weighed against the clinical need. So basically there's also this thing. So what I mentioned here falls in the area of what's known as a sort of utilitarianism, and I'm not really going to delve into that. It's more of what's known as a social science construct, really. But utilitarianism is basically where health professionals who need to make decisions, they have to make decisions based on where, for example, they may have as little information as possible, but the patient or individual in this context, for example, whose plasma or serum has not been screened for the presence of potential harmful or atypical alloantibodies or antibodies. However, in that situation, they have to make a decision, and if it means that they're going to do something harmful, but actually the patient gets maximum benefit, or gets maximum benefit because of that decision, then that is actually on the line of what's known as utilitarianism. And it works not just in blood transfusion, it works in transplantation as well. So the clinical need is on this basis. So there's also the clinical need, another aspect of clinical need that I'm going to highlight, and an increased possibility of error also exists when in haste situations. When in haste or in disruption or created by emergency or upsets to upsets of around routine transfusion procedures, laboratory procedures. So in this regard, one of the main things that laboratory medicine specialists, whether in hematology or transfusion and any other area of pathology, generally what happens is, in anticipation of any potential emergencies, laboratory medicine and pathology professionals generally are prompted to refer to standard operating procedures to deal with any situations, and that becomes essential, because generally speaking, with standard operating procedures, it allows an audit of steps where everyone has everyone's steps, whichever steps they do through a particular standard operating procedures are standardized, so they can backtrack on those standardized areas, and know that, for example, let's say, for example, in a standard operating procedure, there are, let's say, there are 30 steps, like 30 steps in relating to an area of a practice, generally speaking, and that's generally speaking, and basically, and let's say everyone in a situation has followed all the steps up to from 1 to 30, but let's say at say step 25 or 26, or something like that. Let's say at 25 or 26 something's gone wrong, and basically it is then up to the lead laboratory members of the staff to actually ask all those who are involved to actually highlight what they did according to the standard operating procedure. So it's essential in that regard, and it becomes even more essential in emergency-based situations as well. On this note, the following, I'm just going to give a bit of an example of a transfusion practice in an emergency situation, and this is what I'm going to say now is part of some aspects that come out of standard operating procedures, historically, but generally still applicable. So it's where in emergency situations, patients who are bleeding or hemorrhaging, for example, in sort of emergencies, transfusion scientists generally, upon or part of fulfilling particular requests, would have to issue 2 units of emergency O rhesus D negative blood. So that's blood group O rhesus D negative blood. Then there is also where usually this is also usually where small r, big D, big C, big E, big K negative, and HBS negative, CMV negative, and negative for high titer hemolytic anti-A and anti-B are issued. So on blood packs, where in an emergency situation you have blood group O, then additionally these aspects or components that make up part of the blood pack can be identified on the front of a blood unit, and basically should be given in that situation. And then, unless the patient is off site, a blood group should be rapidly obtained. So although that sounds quite primitive, generally, believe it or not, in transfusion laboratories and practice, it has been known that in emergency situations that a patient's blood group may not even be known. So frontline health professionals have to make it incumbent that as part of their training, and also as part of their work, they have to know the blood group and actually not just know the blood group of the patient who might be bleeding out, but make sure that the transfusion practitioners and scientists know about that as well, because everything in emergency situation, nothing is more important than communication. And believe it or not, communication can be lost in those emergency situations. So a blood group should be rapidly obtained unless the patient is off site. So, for example, if a patient has for example, has not been known to the laboratory staff, and is not known to in an emergency. And what I mean here is where a patient before even becoming a patient, they may have been involved in a road traffic accident, for example. Then at that point, obviously blood group is not blood group is not going to be known. So when they do get into admitted through an accident in an emergency, then it's important and incumbent to know the blood group. And also, blood issued under these circumstances does not always require or should not require retrospective cross-matching. So in an emergency situation, generally speaking, everything almost becomes streamlined, apart from following particular areas of standard operating procedures that are known. Generally speaking, cross-matching at that point becomes sort of semi-obsolete. Cross-matching becomes important, for example, if a patient again develops any particular antibodies or allo antibodies or auto antibodies, but also if they need a subsequent transfusion owing to a particular hematological condition. So once the patient's blood group is obtained, blood of this group should be issued to the patient, which is obvious. And then generally, in line with practices, it's important to ensure that that laboratory staff, as well as those who are frontline health professionals, keep up to areas of practices. And in this context, I've highlighted a few references, and I've made my own acknowledgements, and I've made the same sort of reference list in a previous audio podcast, so I won't mention this again, but this reference, the reference is available to download through the internet. It's available for free. In some parts of the publication, of the book publication, it is quite detailed. However, it is a recommended reading from areas of transfusion practices, and under the International Society of Blood Transfusion, under the Science series. I want to say thank you for listening. This has been another Storm Lobostics production. This has been the Shientist, and hopefully in subsequent episode, in subsequent audios and podcasts, I will look to be collaborating with the renal patient support group, the RPSG. There is one more audio podcast in this series under the under the Busta Cap episode. So for now, I want to say thank you, and hopefully use the timestamps to make any notes if you're going through this through online or through the YouTube channel. Through the YouTube channel. Thank you for listening.